You're listening to a podcast by the Center for Action and Contemplation. To learn more, visit cac.org.
Greetings. I'm Jim Finley.
And I'm Kirsten Oates.
Welcome to Turning to the Mystics.
Welcome, everyone, to Season 11 of Turning to the Mystics. And I'm here with Jim to introduce our new mystic for Season 11. Welcome, Jim.
Yes, glad to start up again, share these insights with the folks.
And so who is our new mystic, Jim, for Season 11?
The new mystic is Gabriel Marcel. And as always, we'll start with who he was historically to help us better understand who he is spiritually. Gabriel Marcel was born in France in 1889, where he lived until his death in 1973. He was a bit of a prodigy, both as a musician and as a composer and as a playwright. But he was mainly known for his philosophy, and that's what we're going to be looking at. You know, from the very beginning of the Turning to the Mystics series of mystics we've been exploring, I've been focusing on the classical texts of the Christian mystics that I was introduced to in the monastery and have guided and sustained me over the years. But in the previous session, we branched out and for the first time turned to a poet as mystic, T.S. Eliot, 4 quartets. We'll be doing more poets in the future, to Emily Dickinson and others. And now we're branching out even more, and we're turning to a philosopher as a mystic, like a mystically awakened philosopher, turning to Marcel's insights, guiding us in our spiritual path.
Wonderful. Jim, can you, for those of us who perhaps aren't familiar with philosophy, could you give us just a high-level overview of what a philosopher does, what their focus is?
So we're talking about philosophy in the big picture. So Plato, Aristotle, these different philosophers down through the ages into the current age, Marcel. A philosopher is someone who shares with us an understanding of what the meaning of life is, or the meaning of reality. What's it mean to exist? What's it mean to be real? So a philosopher doesn't say, for example, we know that truth is important. A philosopher explores what is truth, where it isn't just the goodness is important and the will we turn toward the good, but a philosopher would kind of tease out and bring out into the open ways of understanding what goodness is. That's philosophy. So Gabriel Marcel is a philosopher. And so he's going to share with us a meaning of what he sees to be really what it means to be a person, and how that relates on to what's the meaning of being, what's it mean to be. Philosophia, like the love of wisdom.
And you wouldn't say every philosopher was a mystic, and so how does it pair together that someone might be a philosopher and a mystic?
No, yeah, there's different branches of philosophy. So some aren't mystical at all, like pragmatism, for example. Gabriel Marcel was often linked up with the existential thought of France, existentialism, exploring the meaning of existence. So although the father of existentialism is Soren Kierkegaard, who is a Christian, devout Christian. There's a strong, also in contemporary French philosophy, a strong vein of atheism. So Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, was an atheist. And he thought the meaning of life is nausea, that there is no meaning. He wrote a book called No Exit, and it's the persons of the Trinity realizing they're each other's hell and they're trapped with each other forever.
Oh, dear.
That's hardly mystical. And so he kind of parted from this existential identity, and he referred more to himself as a neo-Socratic philosopher. And what Socrates is, when you look at the dialogues of Socrates, what he would do is he would engage in a dialogue with someone about, say, what is goodness? And they would begin by assuming that they knew what goodness was. And by the end of the dialogue, they realized they didn't know at all what goodness was. But in realizing that, they started to understand what goodness is. So that's what Marcel does. He kind of unravels assumptions to bring us to a clarity that when we hear it, it rings true. So that's the tone of Marcel's philosophy. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Jim, tell us a little bit more about his life, Gabriel Marcel.
He studied his graduate work in philosophy, but he wasn't a philosopher in the sense of the academy, in a typical sense. He was not a tenured professor on campus at a university, but he was more of a loner, like thinking alone, apart to himself, but often invited to universities around the world to lecture. And a lot of philosophers were in very serious dialogue with him. They saw the relevance of his thought. He was married. They had one adopted son. His wife would travel with him to these different lecture places. He wrote a little essay on his spiritual autobiography, and it noted that when he was very young, his mother died. And his mother was very influential in his life. He was very close to his mother. So very typical of the kind of insights of Marcel, the kind of things he says, thinking of his mother. He said, it's amazing how present a dead person can be.
Wow.
And so he has those kind of poetic insights into what's most fundamental in life itself. He's always going back to the fundamental experiences in helping us explore the abyss-like depth of fundamental experiences of the day by day.
It sounds like he paid a lot of attention to relationships, the relationship with his mother, with his wife, with his son.
Yes, he was very big on what he referred to as intersubjectivity. We all are distinct, but we're all distinct presences interwoven with the presences of each other as a communal oneness with one another, which he is then going to see as a communal oneness with the mystery of being, which he's going to see as ultimately is a oneness with the mystery of God. So he's very big on interconnectedness, because one of the marks of being is communion. You realize you're subsisting in a communion or in a communal oneness. We would say in Christian terms, echoing Thomas Merton, he says that when Christ says I and I say I, it's the same I, the order of grace and love. And that's very Marcellian. He's always looking toward this, how do we walk in the sense of communion? Our fear and confusion is we lose that sense of communion that's always there. We fall into the fear of being isolated and alone, and so on. So where does aloneness turn into solitude? And what is the communion of solitude? Marcel's mind works along those lines.
So, Jim, when Marcel began his career, and for quite a period of his career as a philosopher, he wasn't a person of faith. He was an atheist, in fact. Is that right?
I don't think he was an atheist. I think during all the time he was writing this philosophy we'll be exploring, he didn't personally find religious faith relevant.
Okay.
He didn't feel moved or inclined to. Later, he became Catholic and remained a devout Catholic throughout his life. And matter of fact, other philosophers accused him of promoting Christianity in the name of philosophy. And he said, but I came to these insights before I became Catholic. This way. So this is really finding the presence of the spiritual outside the world religions.
Okay.
And another key thing then also, that's how we understand New Age spirituality. It's the spiritual quest outside the world religions. You're spiritual, but you're not identifying with, you're not Jewish or Christian or Buddhist, whatever. But so the issue would be this, though. To what extent does the spiritual path outside the religions, to what extent is it infinite? That is, to what extent does it reach that we are the manifested presence of the infinite? And Marcel does that. And he does it outside of religion.
Then did religion enhance his journey into that?
I think what it did is it affirmed the relevance of his thought and saw how faith then is the revelation, the personal revelation of God being revealed through the scriptures of this mystery of being, this mystery of life, revealed in the Christian dispensation through Christ Jesus our Lord, through Jesus. And so I think it's why it spoke to him so deeply. So the Eucharist and the liturgy and Scripture, the life of devotional sincerity, and he even says that about the life of the philosopher, this wisdom. He said, first, it's found in a presence. And the presence, he said, a certain attitude must be brought to the portals of thought. It's humility. And the wisdom is the wisdom that's born and being stabilized in humility. Never humiliated, but endlessly humbled by the unfolding of the mystery. So that language is so resonant with the religious sensitivity.
Yes.
So when he became Catholic, he saw it as a way to celebrate that, or a community that expresses that. And that's
to
my
live
sense
into
of
that
it.
humility and community and communion, some of the elements that
Yeah.
he found. Yeah, beautiful.
Yes.
What a beautiful way to explore alongside Marcel, who came into his faith through this deep study of reality and existence.
And turning to Marcel, in my approach, I want to stay true to the spirit of the Turning to the Mystics podcast. By that I mean this: I'm going to feel very free in exploring in very explicit terms the mystical dimensions of Marcel's thought. They will in many cases be very present but implicit in his thought as a philosopher. It gets more and more explicitly mystical as he goes along, because he explores being. He realizes that being is ultimately understood as infinite intelligence and infinite love, and that being is infinite and eternal, and ultimately it's God. But still, he's looking at it philosophically as the mystery of being. But I'm going to keep weaving it in to explicitly mystical language that the listeners are used to. Likewise, when we do the coaching session, I want to do a session on how to pray with Marcel. Like what would it be to practice Lectio Divina, meditation, prayer, and sitting in contemplation under the guidance of Gabriel Marcel. And that way we'll be of one accord in the spirit of the podcast.
Lovely. Just to say that back to you, Jim, that just like with T.S. Eliot's poetry, we could have studied that from many different angles, as a literary work, as the way he expanded on the poetic rhythms, but you honed in on the mystical aspects of it. And so you're going to do the same with Marcel.
That's exactly right. And using T.S. Eliot as an example, he has amazing, very contemporary insights into the nature of time. It runs through the whole thing. But then he starts looking, though, where time opens out upon eternity, like the eternality, like that which never passes away, ribbon through everything, endlessly passing away, and is that getting more and more open? And he explicitly ties that in then with Christ. And so Marcel does the very same thing. But in his philosophy, he doesn't explicitly tie it in with eventually with his Catholic faith, but he ties it in with being as ultimately realized to be infinite and eternal, and ultimately to be God, come to through a mystical illumination of the nature of reality itself outside of religion. I think it's kind of refreshing. It sees the universality of the presence of God that the religions bear witness to. The presence of God overflows religious belief systems and overflows into reality itself.
Yes.
The passage of time, the sun moving across the sky. What does it mean to love? What does it mean to die? It's to see the divinity of the immediacy of these foundational things.
And that's really how you define a mystic, Jim, is someone who experiences that presence in reality. And so for Marcel, once he had that in-depth experience, he saw that the Christian language and symbolism lined up with what he experienced.
Yes, and I'm saying this too about what we're saying who mystics are. He says, for example, he's talking about being, the fullness of being. And he says, we really can't define it because it's not categorizable. We can't categorize that which is the source of all categorizations. He says, so really it's given to us not as a thought, but it's given to us as a presence. We need to look at the moments we become more deeply present, and we experience that we're somehow present in a way that we're subsisting in a boundaryless presence. So we have to shift into that meditative mode of consciousness. So he's going to say, we all have little fleeting moments of presence, and we might say in those moments we're a momentary mystic. Mystics are those for whom that the divinity of the immediacy of what is an underlying habitual state of sensitivity. And that's what he's leading us to. So he's going to say, well, now that we've borne witness to this mystical dimension of presence, and we can see how elusive it is, what are the ways, what's the path talk? What's the path along which we can be habitually established in the divinity of presence? And that's where he follows the teachings of the mystics. See, they first bear witness to the divinity of what is. But then what are the signs that we're being lured toward a longing to abide in that oneness so fleeting, like glimpse. And then what's the path along, like the way of a pilgrim? See, what's the path along? And this is just what Marcel is doing. And the three ways he explores is fidelity, hope, and love. He looks very deeply at the fidelity dimensions of our life and how by exploring it and surrendering to it, we can be habitually established in ever more mystical sensitivity to the divinity of the immediacy of standing up and sitting down, of life itself.
So just like with many of the mystics, you talk about these vision aspects and then the path aspects.
That's
So
right.
the vision being like a worldview, and then the path being how we might experientially find ourselves entering into that.
Yes. And I want to say something here. In my first session that I'll be doing alone, I'll be laying out the vision aspects of Marcel's thought, like what's life look like through awakened eyes, the mystical worldview. And then we're going to move from there and pointing out the ways that Marcel notices the ways that we all fleetingly sense that ourselves. And we're like a momentary mystic in moments of awakened presence where we become more present. So then he says, but notice how elusive it is. Like it's very fleeting, it comes and goes. So then he switches into path talk. What is the way of life, or the path along which we become ever more habitually established in this boundaryless presence, this presencing itself as our presence, the presence of all things. And he does that by exploring the mystery of fidelity, the mystery of hope, and the mystery of love. It's three modalities of this path of mystical awakening. And he's going to describe it in such a way, we can tell he's putting words to what we've experienced. And he's helping us be more sensibly established in that. And one of the themes that I'll be exploring, because it's the heart of his teaching, I want to say it briefly here to just say it. He says, he starts out, he wants us to understand the nature between the problematic and mysterious dimension of our lives. And the problematic dimension are the problems that we face that are dualistically other than us. So for example, the fact that my car won't start is a problem. Or the fact that some kind of insects are destroying my vegetable garden is a problem. See? Or there's a mathematical question, like how do I get the answer? Mm-hmm. So what we look for in the problematic, which is the realm of science, we look for a method to help us solve the problem. And then when we solve the problem, we move on to the next problem. But he says a mystery is different, because when we turn towards what's mysterious, we're turning towards that which includes us. Mm. So when I ask, like, what does it mean to be a human being? It's always me as a human being asking, what is it to be a human being? When I ask, what is consciousness? It's me and my consciousness asking, what is consciousness? What is love? It's me and my capacity for love asking, what is love? What is death? So being human and consciousness and love and death aren't problems, they're mysteries. But here's the key to Marcel's thought. He doesn't mean it includes us, as everything reverts back to our subjective opinion, our subjective feeling. He means the opposite. He means it includes us in that we're included in infinity, a being itself, as its portal or as its manifestation, as this thing. And that's the mystical part of Marcel's thought. He says, I'm carried along by a mystery that transcends me and endlessly includes me, as it manifests itself as me, and one with the boundarylessness. And how do I come to the realization of that? And how do I live in that? That's what's mystical about Marcel's thought.
Wow.
I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I just need to take a pause there. That was beautiful, very inspiring. So it really touched my heart deeply when I'm part of something that transcends me, but includes me.
Always includes me, because I'm woven into it, woven into me, carrying myself out, being endlessly identified with that which is endless.
Yeah.
So this is where he goes into his themes that we're eternal, that we're boundaryless. And you can tell by Marcel's thought, this is where we'll be going very slow. Because you can't, just like T.S. Eliot, you can't skim read Gabriel Marcel.
Yeah.
So we kind of, like the medium is the message, we have to speak of it in an unhurried, poetic, invitational way. That as the people are listening, they get a sense, it's a way of putting words to what their awakening heart knows is true. It helps them to be more established in sensitivity to this dimension of themselves in the day by day. Turning to the mystics will continue in a moment.
This Lent, join our free virtual sit meditations inspired by Richard Rohr's new book, The Tears of Things. Enter contemplative stillness in a shared online space every Sunday during Lent. Father Richard leads the first sit on March 9th at 8:30 a.m. Pacific. Prepare for each practice with our free Lenten email series. Learn more at cac.org/Lent-sits. That's cac.org/LENT-SITS.
Even the way you describe the difference between a problem and mystery helps me understand why you have to pause and go slow on the side of mystery, because the problem is objective. You know, it has cause and effect. There's a solution that can be stepped through. It's linear, but then mystery takes us into a whole different,
very different
experience. Yeah.
And another key insight to Marcel, I think, where he's always trying to help us see this practically, is he talks about primary and secondary reflection. So he says primary reflection is reflecting on what's objectively real and quantifiable as other than us. My car won't start, all that's primary reflection. Secondary reflection is the reflection of realizing the inadequacy of primary reflection. By being experientially grounded in that which transcends that which can be answered as a presence. And so the very way of listening to him, we can follow him by listening to his voice. He's moving us into a secondary reflection. Otherwise, we couldn't follow him. He's not defining anything because it's not definable. He's not explaining it. It's not explainable because there's no it to it. It's not an it. It's the infinite abyss-like reality of every it. I think what Marcel's doing also, I often think, he's putting words to things that in our own awakening heart we know is true, but we tend to forget. And he's helping us remember and be more present to this unitive mystery that alone is ultimately real. And we are its manifestation.
I'm curious about, you said he uses, in terms of the path, fidelity, hope, and love, which sounds very similar to faith, hope, and love. But you said he doesn't put a Christian spin on it.
Yes. On purpose, he deliberately is avoiding the theological language of Paul, like fidelity, like faith, hope, and love. Of these three, love is the greatest. So he's removing it from its revelation in Scripture, faith, hope, and love, and he's removing it to how is the mystery of fidelity realized in the depth dimensions of life itself. How is hope realized in the dimensions of life itself? For example, he's going to start exploring how hope is not hoping for something that might happen. Psychologically, hope is hoping that we'll be ever more experientially grounded in what alone is ultimately already happening, is hope. So that's what he does. And then when he turns to love, especially where he turns on that we're eternal. You know you've learned to love someone when you've seen in them that which is too beautiful to die. And you know you learn to love yourself when you see that in you that is too beautiful to die. So that's the tone of Marcel's thought.
Hearing you reflect on him, there's a lot of themes you've pulled out in the mystics across our seasons. So Gabriel's obviously been a big influence on you, Jim, in the way you approach mystics.
He really has. Yes, he has, very much so. So, for example, when St. John of the Cross says, to have no light to guide you except the one that burns in your heart. That's very beautiful. And the light that burns in your heart is the light of God's love. See, shining out from your heart. And that's the light of Gabriel Marcel. It's the light that's shining out from his heart. So as we listen to him, it starts shining out from ours. And so you can see the threads of continuity or resonances. And that's what I mean by the mystical dimensions of Marcel's thought.
Did you study philosophy in the monastery?
Yes. I should say this too, is that when I was in the monastery, I was first introduced to Marcel. Thomas Merton would speak to the novices. He would mention Marcel and different people. But I also had an opportunity for 2 years to study the philosophical theology of the Middle Ages from Daniel Walsh. And Daniel Walsh got his doctoral dissertation in philosophy from Etienne Gilson, who was a famous Catholic philosopher in the Middle Ages. So I got to sit very deeply study with the Neoplatonic, Augustinian, Franciscan philosophical theology, the primacy of love of Duns Scotus and Bonaventure, and so on. But then also the Aristotelian philosophy of Thomas Aquinas and the Summa Theologica. And that metaphysical language also had a very deep effect on me. So when I read Marcel, he's in that, how do we put words to what it means to be? And also, we'd say this, another way of saying it, this, for example, is that God is not a being that exists. Like, it isn't we believe in some invisible being that exists. Rather, God is the word that we use for the infinity of being itself, being the infinity of being itself. And ultimately, we're not either, because we're subsisting in that. That's what it means to be a person.
Yeah.
So that kind of metaphysical language, for some reason, it just has always felt very, I like it. And I think it's implicitly present in deep psychotherapy too, in the depths of psychotherapy. It's like a language for the undefinable, unexplainable gift of yourself. It's precious in your brokenness. And really it's the unveiling of your being. It's the unveiling of your presence. Yeah.
So those philosophers you mentioned that you studied for those 2 years, they were explicitly Christian, but then when you turned to Marcel, you found that implicit same mystical depth.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And we'll be turning to other philosophers too, like Karl Jaspers, for example, as a philosopher. And so Karl Jaspers says, the known is always accompanied by the unknown. And he said, we might be tempted to think if we just keep knowing more and more and more, we can overcome the unknown. But something in us rebels against this. And he calls the unknown the all-encompassing. And the all-encompassing is the humility in which we have clarity with the known. He's talking as a philosopher. But you can see that the spiritual resonances and the depth and the beauty of that kind of language. And Marcel's like that.
Yeah, yeah. It's beautiful to have this different approach because I know as we've studied the different mystics and then the poet T.S. Eliot, some kind of mystical language just resonates better with certain people, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
So you love philosophy. It's very resonant for you.
For me, that's right. And later on, as we keep going, I want to look at the mystical traditions of all the great world's religions, of Judaism, deep study of Torah and Kabbalah, the deep study of Hinduism, Namaste, I am that, the deep study of the Buddha turning the wheel of the Dharma, what he realized on the night of his enlightenment, and how can we realize what the Buddha realized this way, and so on. So we're going to be looking also at these different languages of the universality of this mystical dimension of the immediacy of ourselves. It's wisdom traditions. And so each listener will listen, and some of it won't speak to them at all. Teach their own. A certain one that doesn't speak to you, somebody else kind of goes, wow.
Yeah.
But when you go wow with someone, they don't, not for them.
Yeah.
It shows you it's universally personal. But it's good to just be receptively open to all these voices. Because if you really listen, there's a kind of a musical quality that runs through all of them.
Yes.
And I think we're trying to tune into that and stay with that.
That's the beauty of staying with you, Jim, across the seasons, because you kind of resonate at that same note. And even if we've discovered that the mystic's not for us going forward, I think there's always something to get from each one, another angle of your understanding.
I want to add something else, too, as a clarifying note. These basic themes of Marcel, they're found throughout all of his writings. And so there's a book by Kenneth Gallagher called The Philosophy of Gabriel Marcel, who himself is a gifted philosopher. And so what he did is he went through all those writings and brought them into a succinct order in a single book. And Gabriel Marcel wrote the foreword to his writings and endorsed it and said, Gallagher's, this is it. So what we're always trying to do is to make these, without watering these teachings down, to make them as accessible as possible. So I'll be very carefully following Gallagher's work.
So that's the main book you'll be using for this season.
Yeah, and because I'll be using his sequence. And also then when he quotes Marcel, it'll be in the context of that sequence.
Yeah.
And I'm doing it because for those who are, a lot of people won't be inclined, but those who are so inclined can get Gallagher's book.
Yes.
Yeah, it's called The Philosophy of Gabriel Marcel, and Kenneth T. Gallagher. The edition that I have is Clooney Press, Providence, Rhode Island. We'll be posting this or clarifying it for people.
Yeah.
And 2020, I think it came out. Likewise, when I go through quoting, I always give the page number in this edition of Gallagher. The other work that I'll be using primarily is Gabriel Marcel's own essay on the ontological mystery, meaning the mystery of being that the self embodies. And the ontological mystery is the first chapter of his book called The Philosophy of Existentialism. Mm-hmm. And the Philosophy of Existentialism was reissued under a new title, The Philosophy of Existence.
Yeah.
And so I'll be quoting also from that and giving the page numbers in that edition. And again, The Philosophy of Existence is Clooney Press, Providence. So it'll be The Ontological Mystery of Marcel in The Philosophy of Existence and The Philosophy of Gabriel Marcel by Kenneth Gallagher. And those are the two main texts, but I'll be referring to several others, but kind of more in passing. But I'll always give the text and the title and the author and so on. So those who care to pursue it, like trying to make it as accessible and simple as possible, they can get a hold of Gallagher and sit down with it and get a cup of herb tea and settle in. You know what I mean?
Sounds good. Sounds very good.
But what we're trying to do here is, without watering it down, illuminating. See, to put a language to this is very simple, actually. And then once you get used to it, if you're drawn to do it, it can be a kind of Lectio Divina to slowly sit with the obscurity of a text and underline it as almost a kind of a meditatio. If you're drawn to it, it's to each his own.
It's reminiscent to me of Meister Eckhart. As I read Gallagher and Meister Eckhart, it's got a similar kind of sense to it.
That's a very good insight. See, because notice in St. John of the Cross, he gives a certain way to pray in Passage Through a Dark Night. Notice in Teresa of Avila, she gives a certain way to pray as you enter the fourth mansion. Notice in A Ladder of Monks, Guigo II, he gives a certain way to pray. With Eckhart, there's no way to pray.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Because what he does is he teaches a path of detachment, which meaning don't have closure in any thought about anything at all. Don't reject anything, but just know that don't rest there as if it's enough. And as you learn to be released from your dependence on thinking, a brighter light starts shining through existence itself, the birth of the word in the soul, in life itself. And Marcel's very much like that. Yeah, that's true. Merton was very much like that too. Merton never offers a way to practice contemplation. He gives insights into it, but mainly he's concerned about the way of life, of how do we taste the divinity of the rhythms of existence itself. And so Merton and Eckhart and Marcel, you see that same thread kind of running, and others as well.
And you said Merton was the one that introduced you to Marcel.
Yeah, he'd give talks to the novices, and he would mention St. Augustine and different people, so it would always be St. Marcel. But it wasn't until I studied metaphysics with Dan Walsh, and he would start talking about these medieval philosophers as well as contemporary philosophers. And he spoke so highly of Marcel. So then when I got Marcel and started reading him, I was so moved by how beautiful his mind is. I thought, well, wait, what a stunning presence Marcel is. And I've been reading him ever since over the years. Yeah.
I love that story from your memoir where you talked about how you never thought of yourself as intelligent, and then you started studying philosophy and metaphysics and your brain just lit up with understanding and excitement. Yeah.
It's interesting I was 18 at the time. It's real interesting when a person discovers a gifted dimension of themselves they didn't know existed. When they first light up about music or dance or poetry, you know what I mean? Or mathematics, like they light up inside, like something like lights up, and that's what it was for me.
Yeah.
And then I merged, the metaphysic and the mystical were woven into each other simultaneously. And it's how they each mirror each other was really kind of foundational for me, along with all the world religions, the mystical lineages. And then later I saw it as the depth dimension of healing as a psychotherapist. That is the depth dimension of the healing encounter. Mm-hmm. I think this way, yeah.
It's one of the reasons I'm excited to study this alongside you, Jim, is just knowing that about your life and how this language awakened you to this aspect of yourself. Yeah.
Yeah.
You knew someone who met Marcel.
Yes. There was a woman who came to one of my retreats. She had moved to France, and she didn't know French. She just moved to France from England, I think. And Marcel invite people once a week to come to his living room at night to sit together in a circle, an intimate setting. Mm-hmm. She was invited to one of the professors to sit in on those evenings. And even though she didn't understand a word of Marcel, being in his presence was so moving to her. And so she learned French. So she gave me 3 volumes of Marcel's writings in French. I was studying French for a while, but I never stayed with it. But I was so touched by how moved she was by his presence. And I think with all these mystics who, when we read them in a sincere way, you sense the presence of Marcel. See, that's why I say, who was he historically, to help understand who he is spiritually? Because his deathless presence is in the beauty of his voice. You know, it goes right to our heart. Like it speaks to us. It's perennial. You know.
One of the interesting things about him is that he wrote a lot of plays and they weren't popular. And he was disappointed by that.
Yes. He was disappointed, see, because he's so concerned about life.
Yeah.
Because when you really look at it, Shakespeare, whatever, the powerful thing about a play, it reveals us to ourselves. See, it helps us to see a dimension of life about ourselves. So his plays, the characters in the play are embodying his philosophy. You know, they're embodying the sense of being, they're embodying fidelity, they're embodying, and he was disappointed that it never really caught on.
Jim, how do you think Marcel's insights help us with our modern challenges, with everyday life?
I think this is true of the mystics, too, and it's true of Jesus and the Buddha faith. The thing about modern life, I think, and I think of the current political scene, and the war in Ukraine and so on, we get so caught up in the intensity of the historical situation, it closes off experiential access to the depth dimensions of our life this way. And that's what trauma is, really. Trauma is the traumatized capacity to be experientially grounded in the abyss-like depth that's sustaining us always. Come what may, even up to the moment of our death. We get reduced to the outcome of the situation. Oh, how's this going to turn out? Not that it doesn't matter how it turns out. And not that we shouldn't be present as we're called to do so, to be a force toward the good as we think it should work. But it's to be grounded in an inner peace. It's not dependent on the outcome of our efforts, because it's the peace of God on which everything depends. And I think Marcel helps reestablish us in that.
Wonderful.
But I think also, I have to say this too, lastly, he reestablishes us in that insofar as we linger in it long enough to let it soak in. So if we just read it in passing before we turn on the TV and have lunch, it doesn't touch us at all. So we have to be drawn by the beauty of his language to sit with it, to soak in and find a grounding place within ourselves of that which he speaks. And I think that's how he's helpful.
Wonderful. Well, I'm excited to linger on Marcel with you this season, Jim, and I'm sure our listeners will be also. And so what a great introduction. And we'll put the details about the books you'll be using in the show notes so that if anyone wants to read along, they can get the books. And I think that's it for our first introduction. Thank you, Dorothy and Corey in the background, and Vanessa now. We have some additional support. And Jim, thank you so much. I'm excited to do this season with you.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Turning to the Mystics, a podcast created by the Centre for Action and Contemplation. We're planning to do episodes that answer your questions. So if you have a question, please email us at podcasts@cac.org or send us a voicemail. All of this information can be found in the show notes. We'll see you again soon.
Do you feel called to walk a more contemplative path? The Center for Action and Contemplation is an educational nonprofit supporting the journey of inner transformation. Our programs and resources will help grow your consciousness, deepen your prayer practice, and strengthen your compassionate engagement with the world. Learn more about our resources, such as publications, podcasts, email series, and events at www.cac.org.